Peace and blessings. Today's post is called The False Equivalent, Lying by Omission. I have different angles I want to go. I could go into, but I won't because I want to stay specific and concise and succinct. Um, where this post was prompted by a few different sources. So the first one was listen to satellite radio, and it was a historian speaking about the current events as of this post in reference to the breaching of the Capitol, the federal Capitol, the national Capitol. And he was linking it to racism. And specifically, he was speaking of the response of the dominant or white European population towards the activity of the African American. So the first thing he pointed out was after the proclamation um, that was set forth that freed, so-called freed, I always say so-called, but for our history's sake, it freed the enslaved Africans. And then came Reconstruction and then advancements by some African Americans to the point where they serve national federal offices. So the response by the dominant culture was to, you brought forth Jim Crow and took forth and erased and eradicated all the gains or significant gains made by African Americans, to where it took me to get into college to realize and learn that we actually had African senators, African American legislators in the 1800s. The second period that he pointed out was after World War One, when you had advancements of African Americans through segregation, um, specifically, most notably, Wall Street, or as we would know, Rosewood, where African Americans were um, separated from their European counterparts, their countrymen, and they thrived so much so that they had established societies that were more prominent than their white counterparts, which then as people are learning now more about Black Wall Street, sanctioned by the government or sponsored by the government, it was destroyed. So that was the response to another Black advancement or African American advancement. The last one he pointed out was this past election, where African Americans helped to save, or is being called saving the democracy and saving um, the push for fascism by helping in significant ways voting in Joe Biden, Mr. Biden, and Mrs. Harris, or Miss Harris. Along with that, the the voting in Georgia that helped to win Democratic Senate seats from the incumbent Republicans. And the response, he's pointing towards the attack on the uh, Capitol building, the breach into the Capitol building. So I found that quite interesting. The other source that I pull from would be I just read a letter from the superintendent of my youngest princess's school district. And I will not give a caveat, but point out that the school district is less than 4% African American from K to 12. And in his letter, he pointed out the happenings on our Capitol in reference to the Capitol building and how there is a need to educate the student population about racism and the effects of being miseducated. And he was setting the tone to have the educators within the school district utilize the lessons that they already have subscribed or prescribed for the students, but enable and also incorporate lessons on racism and inequities that affect uh, the non-white population. So I thought that was quite interesting that he would point that out, given that less than 4% or about 4% have his students' population in his district under his jurisdiction is African American. So, with those being the backdrops, now I will go forward. So, in reference to looking at the breach, it's quite interesting now as I'm doing the post. Mr. Trump has been impeached twice by the House of Representatives. And in watching the commentary from the liberal stations, news stations, as well as the conservative stations, it's interesting to see how it's being reported. So it would appear that I'm picking on the Republicans, but it's not that I'm picking on them. It's just that the information or the way they're presenting their case is so obvious that they're lying by omission. An example would be, I was watching on Fox News, and I don't recall the gentleman's name who was guest, but the theme was the censorship of Mr. Trump, his social media accounts being censored or closed down, shut down indefinitely. Now, where I will agree with the gentleman as he was speaking, he was saying beware of the big companies censoring individuals within the country. And he was speaking about and presenting his case about freedom of speech. And that although Mr. Trump's words are not always the best or aren't politically correct, he should not be censored, because once you go down that road, then others, and he made a point to say, you liberals are out here maybe smiling, laughing, and celebrating, they will come after you next. So I could follow that logic, and he makes a good point in terms of being mindful of speech being taken away under what is considered freedom of speech. Now, where I always chuckle when I watch the conservative station is it's at times the points that they make will be made from a vacuum. So the vacuum being that they don't speak about Mr. Trump. They just move the fact that, yeah, his words are, rough, crass, rude, but, he shouldn't be censored because it's the freedom of speech. And then they go further in speaking on making a point to point out that all of the protesters that were protesting at the Capitol building were not the majority as it relates to those who then breached the Capitol, as well as pointing out that it could be foreign agents or agitators that were the ones doing such as Antifa. Now, where I say the false equivalency comes in is because then they brought up, and this is not just one, this was the several conservative stations that I watched. They brought up Black Lives Matter. And they were saying, one, this is a Marxist, as I heard one Republican congressperson say today in his debating on not voting for the impeachment, that it's a Marxist organization that should also have their speech examined to where it should be taken away. And they likened the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer to the protests that just took place where the breach took place. Where the false equivalency comes in with that is that, one, Black Lives Matters people who were protesting against police brutality, individuals being killed by some rogue police, or by some police, I should say. Along with that, there was protests around the world in reference to police brutality in support of the Black Lives Matter protests that were taking place in this country, versus the protests that were taking place by those who are Trump supporters and those who were conservatives that were in Washington. They were protesting because their candidate lost an election. People being killed by rogue police losing an election. And then for the ones who lost the election, a segment of those who were there at the protest then breached the Capitol building and made it known verbally they were seeking to do harm to legislators. False equivalent. Along with that, they went as far as to state that I'm pausing because I want to make sure I use my words, say it clearly and concisely. They were able to, the conservatives, or those who consider themselves conservatives, to critically think and analyze and say, wait, the majority of the protesters at the Washington, at this recent protest, protesting and what their assertions of the stealing of the election that caused Mr. Trump to lose, they were able to say, wait a minute, the majority of the people protesting were peaceful. And there was another segment which could possibly have been foreign agents who then stormed and breached the Capitol building, which you can make a case for that. But the false equivalent is real interesting that when that was said in the summertime with Black Lives Matter people saying, well, wait, the majority of the protesters for the Black Lives Matters were peaceful. They did their protest and then they went home. And then there were outside agitators there could potentially other agitators who came in and then caused damage to buildings and police property throughout the nation. When that was said, people on the conservative side said, no, 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 no. All of you were Black Lives Matter. Which then had me question, do they actually know how to critically think? But they answered that question because they do, because they were able to separate when it came to the breaching of the Capitol building. And then they were able to separate language. So with the Black Lives Matter, and I'm going to finish with this point, with the Black Lives Matter and how it becomes racial, again, circling back to that point, was when the Black Lives Matter protests took place in Washington. The National Guard was out there. They were already set up, and they were using tools to push Black Lives Matter people away from the areas in which they wanted them to be. Versus, and you know where I'm going, what took place in the breaching of the Capitol building, where actually 5 people lost their lives. Threats were made to legislators. The National Capitol building was breached. And as the reports are coming out, this is a building that is supposedly well secured. So now there's implications, allegedly, that there was an inside job. So false equivalent. People were killed, but there were also selfies being taken with the police. That didn't take place with Black Lives Matter. And again, they didn't chant or spew that they want to kill legislators and so on. I just shake my head. False equivalent. Lastly, I said last before, but this is the last. The speech. It ties into what I said in the speech. There's a law that you can't go into a crowded theater or a theater and yell fire when there is no fire, because that could potentially cause damage with people rushing to get out, or a stampede where people can damage property as well as trample someone, and there could be bodily harm and or death. So so everyone understands that aspect. But yet, for those who defend Mr. Trump's speech or from his rally, the words that he used in terms of saying, let's march down to the Capitol building and let the legislators know, give support to those who are fighting our cause, meaning their cause in terms of fighting the assertion of a stolen election. those who support him saying, well, no, these words did not help to incite a riot. Let's examine that. Or should be linked to igniting the breach at the Capitol building. So let's examine that. By Mr. Trump's team of lawyers, they went through the legal system, presenting their cases in reference to widespread voter fraud. All of those lawsuits were thrown out. So these were by Republican judges he appointed, as well as, quote, the so-called liberal judges. So to make that assertion after that has taken place, after the process has been taking place through the certification of the Electoral College votes, through the recognition of the Electoral College vote certification in terms of the legislator, to make the assertion that it was stolen and we're still fighting for it is a false claim, like going into a crowded theater and yelling fire. So by making the false assertion at the rally, by then directing followers to go down to the Capitol building, some being armed, some wearing paraphernalia that spews hate, you're helping to ignite or throw fire or a match on gasoline. You may not like it. I don't care if it was Mr. Obama. If he did it, I would be saying the same thing. If one of my brothers did it or one of my sisters did it and they were in a position like that, anywhere, I would be saying the same thing, because the truth is the truth. It doesn't matter who you down with. So that's what you've heard me say before. You can still like Mr. Trump, and that's your thing. But if a person is wrong, they're wrong. And if you're supposed to be a leader, you're supposed to own your ways and actions. So that is something I wanted to share. False equivalency, omission by lies, lying by omission. And we should continue to be mindful of that as we're listening to whoever you're listening to. Listen to different sources, but whoever you subscribe to get your information from, look for the consistency, look for the gaps in the logic. If you hear them or you read them or you digest, if you're reading and you're digesting that, look for that. See if the lines are connected. See where they start the conversation or start their argument or their presentation. So like I started when a gentleman talked about from the conservative, who was a guest on a conservative show, TV show, network. He makes a good point about beware of the big companies, in this case, social media, censoring people. We all should be aware of that. But in his example, in terms of Mr. Trump, he omits what I just laid out in terms of being the match that light the gasoline. And along with that, what he admitted, which I didn't say, but I say it now because I'm thinking about it, is that as the breach was taking place, instead of calling to see what's going on with his vice president, it's already documented that he was calling another senator to say, keep up the delay with the fight. But he called the wrong senator, who that person then passed the phone to the person that he wanted to speak to. And the person whose phone it was, he then went to the news and said, this is what took place. So no false news, this is actual fake news, this is actual fact. So instead of being forceful to say, stop the breach, because let's say in his heart of hearts, he'd say, go down there and protest and let your voices be heard outside of the Capitol. Bet. But as soon as the breach took place, and we all can see that, it's documented what he said all the way through. And then eventually, when he so-called said something about go home, be peaceful, by that time it was done. So to defend that, we must look at the people who are defending that. We must look at and be mindful of the reasoning that's being used to defend that. Because, like I said, Reconstruction, African Americans made advancements, quote, white mob, not having it, got rid of that Jim Crow. The 1920s, segregation under Jim Crow, Black Wall Street, and other thriving African American communities, quote, white mob, wasn't having it, destroyed it, sponsored by, in the case of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, sponsored the destruction and the murders of innocent people. And here we go in 2020, and you've heard what I said. The winning of the election, the African Americans voting in large numbers, and then following up voting again in Georgia and helped to secure Senate seats. The response, breaching of the Capitol. Be safe. One love. Wakanda forever. Good time to be an educator. Be educating on real time and examining it and juxtaposing it to what has been documented in the past so that we can learn, teach the babies so that they can learn not to have this repeated. One love. Oh, laughter. Get some vitamin D. Relax. Get some exercise. Stay balanced.